Hello everyone. Hey, look, my mic is working. How's it going today? It is Wednesday, May 28th. We're still in May, even though it seems like it's gone on for a very long time. We are now more than a week out from the release of Daggerheart, and the response has been really, really great, strong and positive, and that is super encouraging and validating since I, among the many, many people who made Daggerheart, put a ton of effort into it, and it's so great to see people connecting with the game and finding that they're excited about it, connecting with the way that it works, and feeling like it's something that they want to bring to the table and are already doing so. For those that don't know me, my name is Mike Underwood. I am a game designer under that name, and I write fiction under Michael R. Underwood. I was one of the designers of Daggerheart, credited as additional designer. And this is not an official stream. As you can see from that thing right here, this is an indication that this is a community gaming license kind of derived or enabled stream where I'm using the Darrington Press Community Gaming License, utilizing the SRD, and then talking and making new things for the game in accordance with that license and those guidelines. So what I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit about adversaries and how they work in Daggerheart, but because I've done a little bit of that already, and I think adversaries are one of the better known parts of the game because they're not obscure in any way, and they fit pretty solidly in a way that is parallel to how people do like monsters and adversaries in a lot of other games. So I want to touch on how adversaries work just a little bit more briefly, and then what I'm imagining the majority of the stream will be is doing some homebrew. And I have some ideas of types of adversaries that we could make, and in doing so explore the kind of how and why of adversary design for Daggerheart. What I'm going to do to start is to pop open the SRD, as I often have, and we're going to look at the kind of introductory information about adversaries. And then we'll jump over to the page where I've started and sketched out ideas for some homebrew. If you are watching live and you have ideas for types of adversaries, not just like the basic type, bruisers, hordes, minions, ranged, so on, but ideas for adversaries that you'd like to see us try to work on today, go ahead and throw those in the chat on Twitch. If you are watching on YouTube and you have ideas or like requests for future homebrew adversaries, you can throw those in the comments. I will avoid creating adversaries that are recreations of like IP-owned things from other universes, just because that gets a little bit trickier in terms of rights. Ideally, what I'm doing here is I'm building adversaries that are then going to be shared on my Patreon and may eventually show up in some community gaming license publication. So with all that set up, let us hop over here. That's my page of the things I was starting to work on, and here is the SRD talking about adversaries. So I'm gonna scroll this down a little bit and then let it show up on the screen. Nope, actually I changed my mind. It's a little bit small for you, but hopefully not in a way that is a problem. Adversaries is the term that we use to talk about basically any NPC, creature, character in Daggerheart that has a strong chance of acting in the story against the player characters, right? They may have an adversarial relationship. Adversaries don't always have to be adversarial, and not every NPC that you run into is necessarily going to become adversarial or have a strong chance of becoming adversarial. But because this is a game about collaboration, you never know where things might go, right? You might the GM might introduce an adversary, and then you're going back and forth with them, and then actually find you have a lot of common ground, and you're no longer working at cross purposes and directly opposing each other. And then the GM may adjust how to manifest their action in the game. moving away from an adversary stat block into some other mode, whether that is a more freeform set of moves or even using an NPC stat block, which we have in the GMing chapter in Daggerheart, and it gives some ideas for how you might utilize and give moves to allied NPCs or NPCs who are acting kind of in concert with player characters rather than more directly in opposition to them. So, big things with adversaries. Gotta have a name. Every adversary has a tier, right? They are built to oppose adversaries of that tier. There is some room for using adversaries that are higher or lower tier than the player characters, but the tools that we have for balancing encounters in Daggerheart don't really focus on using adversaries of a tier that is different than the player character's tier. I think it's easier to add adversaries that are below the player character's tier without it unbalancing the encounter than it is to use an adversary that's above the player character's tier. The biggest places where a tier mismatch is going to show up is in the fact that the damage thresholds really reflect the expected damage capabilities of the player characters of that tier, right? If you throw a tier 3 adversary up against level 3 tier 2 characters, there's a good chance that the adversary's hit point thresholds might be so high that the players are really going to struggle to do probably more than 2 hit points of damage per hit, and they may often do 1 hit point of damage per hit instead of 2, possibly 3, and sometimes 1. Now, if you look at, right, if you take a serious look at an adversary and you think about where the damage capabilities of your party are, maybe you can make it work, but we don't have as much structured support for that type of mismatch, and I'm not going to dwell on that much. It may be that there's official guidance on that coming in the future. I can't speak to that. Adversaries have a type, right? There's a number of different types. These are focused on what role the adversary plays in the scene or is expected to most easily play, right? You might run into an adversary who's classed as a social type, but then you get into combat with them. If they are a social, they're probably not going to be as much of a threat in combat as even a standard adversary. And they're more likely to have features which focus on interpersonal roleplay types of interactions, social interactions. For every adversary, we give you a short description. We give their motives and tactics. This is kind of something you can fall back on when improvising moves with an adversary, or you can use it to help inform the decisions that you make with them in concert with their motivation. Adversaries have a difficulty, right? That's the number you have to meet or beat when you are directly acting against them, including an attack. Like player characters, adversaries have damage thresholds, hit points, and stress. Adversaries have an attack modifier instead of traits, right? Adversaries don't have traits, right? The 6 traits that a player character does. They have an attack modifier, and then they sometimes have experiences. They always add their attack modifier when attacking the player characters, and the GM can spend a fear to add a relevant experience to an attack roll or to a reaction roll when an adversary has to make a reaction roll against a feature from a player character. Every adversary has a listed standard attack. This is like, hey, this is the basic thing that they do if they're in a fight up against the player characters. Many adversaries have separate features that will generate an attack. If they have a feature that says makes a standard attack, you're going to refer back to this main thing. And that attack is going to have a name, a range, a damage value, and the damage type, right? Physical or magical. And then adversaries have features. These are passive, action, or reaction are the types of features. Action is a feature that you use by spending a GM move. A reaction is a GM move you get to make outside of the normal cycle of play. Reactions tell you when they get to apply, And reactions are specific incarnations of the GM rule that the GM can make a move when the player characters do something that would have immediate consequences. Those reaction features are telling you, hey, there's an immediate consequence in this situation, and you can use that move. And passives are features of this adversary that are just truths about who they are, how they exist in the world, and how they interact with player characters and the fiction. And some adversaries have fear features. These are usually actions or reactions that require spending one or more fear to activate, right? So if you have an action that says spend a fear and make a standard attack against every PC or every target within close range, right? That's a fear feature. You have to spend a fear to activate it. If you spent a fear to spotlight this adversary in order to use this feature, you would have to spend a second fear to use that feature, because the first fear was just to get to do the move, and then the second is for the move's cost itself. Okay, so now I'm going to jump back to me. Hello. And then I'm going to scroll down in this SRD so you don't have to see me scrolling all the time. Okay, that looks good. And now we are going to go back here, and I'm on the adversary section of the SRD. Right here we have a handful of adversaries. These are all tier 1. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to unmute. Where'd my thing go? I think I have to do this. Yes, here we are. So this is my own page and some of my notes about adversary homebrew that I want to try to take on today. So a few ideas that I kind of brainstormed over lunch were possessed townfolk, like, oh, okay, the people of this settlement have been possessed by ghosts or mind controlled or something, as a horde adversary. It'd be fun to try to make a rival adventurer, right? So this is another would-be hero adventurer who's coming cross purposes with the player characters. Here I'm thinking of anime rivals. We're thinking of rivals sort of the way that they show up in Call of the Netherdeep, that adventure module from Critical Role and Wizards, and things along those lines, right? Maybe the Americans in the 1999 The Mummy would be rival adventurers. And an interesting thing to try here, I don't know that I'll get to do all of this, is we could make a rival adventurer at each of the 4 tiers, right? That as the player characters advance, this rival would also advance and grow in power, and so that they could clash against the PCs again and again. Another idea, I really wanted to show a phased enemy at a lower tier, right? Phase change is what we call a feature in Daggerheart where an adversary kind of changes form or disposition or does something else big to keep being in the fight, but participate in that fight in such a different way that we switch out what stat block we're using. So in core, we have the Volcanic Dragon has 2 phase changes for a total of 3 stat blocks. And the Fallen Warlord has a phase change so that there's 2 stat blocks, right? You play with the first one, and then there's a certain trigger. Usually the trigger for a phase change is when this adversary marks their last hit point, but that's not the only way you can do a phase change. It's just how it was done in those stat blocks in the core book. When you use phase change, that feature tells you replace this adversary with, and then it tells you what to do. In the core book, we have named them as main name of the thing, colon, and then a phase, right? So it's Volcanic Dragon, colon, Obsidian Predator, Volcanic Dragon, colon, Ashen Tyrant. And so when you have a phase change, it tells you the full name to use so that you can have both of these stat blocks kind of either printed out next to you or on your screen, and you know which one you should be using. So I want to try making a lower tier phased enemy because phase changes are very fun in video games, and I think that they could be a good addition to your game for Daggerheart. And I want to give some more examples of what they might look like without having to wait until you get to like tier 4, which is where we have the phased adversaries there. And with this, we might try an adversary that has a countdown that ticks down or progresses when the players roll with fear. And then when that countdown triggers, that's when they transform with the phase change rather than only when they take their last HP, right? Maybe this adversary can do phase change either when that clock triggers or when that countdown triggers or when they mark their last HP, right? So we have, there's a different timer that might activate first. One thing that's probably useful to look at is a role-play oriented or a social type adversary. In the core book, adversaries like spy and courtesan and some of the other social adversaries have features that are about how they create a problem for the player characters in a social setting rather than something that is oriented toward combat, right? The spy has a feature where you can reveal that the spy has been present in this scene and eavesdropping on the player characters, and then they get a chance to try to stop the spy before the spy can escape. But if the spy gets to escape and relays the information that they've learned from the player characters, the GM gains fear, right? You don't want to let the spy get back to whoever they work for and then report the intel that they got about the player characters. And the last option I had was kind of like a lower tier holy warrior, because in the core book there is a temple environment, right, where you have characters that are like, oh yeah, this temple is probably mostly going to be helpful, but if you cross them, maybe there's some problems. And we have a tier 4 high seraph or seraph in Daggerheart, but we don't have in core as of yet like lower tier holy or divine oriented characters. So that might be a thing to try out. And a thought I had was, could they maybe have a reaction feature on a failure with hope, right? If they're divine, right, then they might have their own relationship to hope and fear. But then is that against the spirit of the game, where normally a failure with hope is creates less of a problem than a failure with fear? So I'm not totally sure about that. It was just something I sketched out, right? I think if we were doing a minor unholy warrior, right, then they would have something that probably triggers on fear. But when an adversary is acting, or when a divine kind of NPC is acting as an adversary, fear is still the resource the GM uses to activate them. So there's a question of how much and where do we want to reframe that hope versus fear dichotomy versus leaving it in place because it kind of goes through the backbone of the story. This is kind of a mirror of the Warlock class that's currently in the Void, the kind of playtest materials, where the Dread domain has some features that are interacting with fear in a way that's different than some of the other domains, right? Because it's the Dread domain, and these characters maybe have a different relationship to fear. And so if it makes sense in the fiction, we can reflect that in the mechanics. That's my quick overview. I'm probably going to go for 90 minutes total because I have something to do at 3 my time, which is now currently 1:22. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of a break between these things. For now, let's take a look at Possessed Townsfolk. So this is I started adjusting but didn't totally tweak, a level 1 horde. Let's see, and I think these were pirates. That's what I was using in the, is that right? Yes. So I was looking at Pirate Raiders Tier 1 Horde. So the other thing we want to have for a horde is a note of how many individuals are represented by 1 HP, right? So if somebody is fighting the Possessed Townsfolk and they deal 1 HP to this horde, how many individual townsfolk does this represent knocking out of the fight, right? And so I think we want to do, this is actually going to be a lot, right? This is 5 people per hit point. So it's a pretty big group. They are not the most dangerous tier 1 enemy, right? I think the big thing with with the Possessed Townfolk is that I want to have some feature where you don't want to kill them, right? Because these are just people, they're not acting under their own control, but they're still creating a problem for you, right? They're still an active threat. And so you're going to want to figure out how to take them out of the fight without hurting them. To look at what we have to begin with, right? These are difficulty 11. These are a little bit less difficult than something like Pirates. Their thresholds are 5 and 11, so 5 damage is major damage, 11 damage is severe. They have 4 hit points, only 2 stress, and then they have a standard attack with a +1 bonus. We probably want to take that down to a +0. And then clubs and pitchforks with melee range to deal 1d8 + 2 physical damage. Because this is a horde, they tend to start with slightly higher damage values. 1, because it's representing getting attacked by everybody at once. And 2, because the horde feature that we see down here is a passive feature that when this adversary have half or more of their HP marked, the standard attack deals less damage, right? You have thinned their numbers, and so they don't hit as hard when they attack you. So a 1d8 + 2 halves down to 1d4 + 1. So these Possessed Townfolk are not a huge challenge to even a first level character, but I think we're going to try to express something else. Right, so they are not in control, and this is a passive. Because Daggerheart defaults to heroic fantasy, I'm going to write this adversary stat block with the assumption that the player characters do not want to kill these townsfolk. Right, and so what that probably means is when attacking the Possessed Townfolk, PCs must take disadvantage to incapacitate rather than harm, or mark a stress. Let's actually say, no, I'm going to put the behavior that we expect up front. Right, take disadvantage on your attack to incapacitate rather than harm, or you have to mark a stress because you're just attacking civilians. I could design this so that it wasn't even possible mechanically to physically hurt these civilians. I think this feature is probably enough for the GM to signal to the player characters, hey, you shouldn't be trying to injure these people. And difficulty of 11, but you're attacking with disadvantage, then creates a bit of a challenge, right? The challenge is not can you beat these townsfolk? The challenge is can you take them out of the fight? Can you kind of break the possession or whatever it is, or knock them out without dealing longer term damage? Understanding that we're in a world of fiction, right? And you can knock somebody out in fiction without it giving them traumatic brain injury. Because this is a tier 1 horde, I might just leave this at that, right? I think there's other things you could do. If you were going to give them more features, I would recommend a reaction or an action. Actually, let's say this is an action called More Join In. Spend a fear to clear up to 2 HP on Possessed Townfolk as more townfolk join the mob. Right? So if you're in a settlement and there's a horde of Possessed Townfolk, there's a decent chance that more people might join that horde as the possessed folks are kind of coalescing into a group. Because this requires spending a fear, right? It's not an easy thing to do. And this adversary is not an especially big threat, right? Because they at most deal 1d8 + 2 damage. Now that can be, that could That could definitely be major damage against a number of characters. It's probably not going to be severe damage against anybody because even at level 1 with Gambus and armor, your thresholds are probably going to be 6 and 12, 5, 11 as the base plus 1 to each because of your level. But more joining in means that it might be that the player characters really have to incapacitate the people in this Possessed Townsfolk group pretty quickly, because if the adversary is defeated, right, we wouldn't use their features. Now, if you defeat a group of Possessed Townsfolk, the GM might say, I'm going to improvise a fear move, spend a fear, and introduce more Possessed Townsfolk. Right? I think that's within the bounds of things that can make sense, but we can signal the way that a possessed group might operate or function within a story by giving them this action. And this is a fear feature, right? Because we spend a fear. If I wanted to, I could tweak this and make it less powerful, right? And say, mark a stress to clear 1 HP on Possessed Townsfolk as more people join the mob. Right? A stress cost is less of a big deal than a fear cost, because a fear can be used for any number of things, and a stress is just a resource for this character, or for this adversary. And the Possessed Townsfolk only have 2 stress. Right? So they could use this at max of twice, and when a NPC or player character has all of their stress marked, they are vulnerable, right? And that vulnerability would negate the disadvantage from trying to incapacitate rather than harm the Possessed Townsfolk. So I think you can go either way. Just for understanding's sake, let's change this. So we're going to change it to 1 hit point. We're going to clear a hit point on Possessed Townsfolk as more people join the mob, right? 1 hit point is represented by 5 individuals because we said 5 per hit point up here. So that can be a completed adversary. Possessed Townsfolk is a tier 1 horde, and there's 5 of them per hit point. These are everyday people possessed by malevolent spirits or mind-controlled by a magic user, right? We're going to round out a little bit of like how these adversaries might come into the story, right? What explains who and what they are. Their motives and tactics: maintain control, ravage the living, obey orders. Maintain control maybe doesn't make as much sense anymore, so I'm going to say, destroy the living, obey orders, and their tactics, right? I think the tactics that they use would be things that the GM is going to do for them. So let's say reflect suppressed humanity, right? Because these are still people. They're just being forced to act in certain ways. And so one of the moves the GM might make, especially a softer move, is to have a possessed person like do something that's just like very human and relatable, to remind the player characters that these are just people who are not in control of themselves. So their difficulty is 11. Their damage thresholds are 5 and 11. We've got their hit points, their stress. Let's put that attack down here. It's a little bit easier to read, and it's kind of in keeping with the way that the stat blocks are written. It's a +0, right? So they're not especially likely to hit the characters that have higher evasion. And then they use clubs and pitchforks at melee range. We could say potentially pitchforks would have very close range, but I don't want to make this complicated. And then they do 1d8 plus 2 physical damage. That damage is reduced if they have 2 or more hit points marked. And then when somebody is attacking them, let's just make these features a little bit more standard. And the line breaks here are a little weird, but I'm not going to focus on it. Because they're not in control, player characters have to take advantage to try to incapacitate the civilians instead of harming them, or mark a stress. And as you take out some of the townsfolk, more could join in and bring the group back up in terms of their hit points, right? If you mark 2 hit points on them, they would do less damage, but then the GM could say, well, more join in, clear an HP. Now they only have 1 HP marked. They go back to their higher damage. But because this is mark of stress on this adversary, they can do that at most twice, unless the GM, through improvising a move or otherwise, clears some of the stress that they've taken. And I'm going to say when Possessed Townfolk is defeated, the possession ends, right? Just to make it clear to the GM, when you're using these adversaries, when the Possessed Townfolk is defeated, the possession ends, right? This is a passive. This overall then represents the narrative and mechanical danger that is presented by having possessed townfolk who are hostile to the player characters. Okay, so that's an adversary. The adversary design in the book is meant to be kind of a foundation to build on and a set of resources to draw from, right? There are a bunch of adversaries. You can use them. You can kind of palette swap them, right? You can reflavor some of these abilities. I'm hoping that people will find enough variety in how the adversary design in the core book works, that along with the tools that are already there, most folks feel comfortable homebrewing and adjusting and, level scaling or tier scaling the adversaries that already exist. Different folks are going to want different levels of support. Spencer Stark, lead designer on the game, has mentioned that a homebrew kit is forthcoming at some point. When that comes out, I'm hoping that will be a great resource that will help a lot of folks. In the meantime, I'm going to talk through the way that I approach it, kind of speaking from my experience, but only utilizing the public material that's in this SRD. Okay, so I'm really curious about trying to do this phased enemy thing with the countdown. So let's jump to that next. And based on the time that's elapsed, I think we might do this adversary and then one more, but this adversary is actually going to be 2 stat blocks because there's a phase change, right? That's not what I wanted to do. So let's get to a new page. And we're just going to write down our notes. And then I'm going to grab the format here that we already have, drop it in there. And so this is going to be Blood Mage. This is not necessarily a Blood Mage from Exandria, just a more generic fantasy Blood Mage. And this is going to be a tier 1 solo. So, hordes are the only adversary that have that number per HP. And then this is a description, so this is going to be a corrupted mage seeking slaughter to gain more power. Right? This is explicitly a blood mage who's like going to spill a bunch of blood because it will give them more power. Not necessarily a hemomancer from Exandria. Now, you can probably use it in that way if they're an adversary. So that's going to be spill blood, harvest power, spill blood, harvest power, bathe. Let's see. I want something that's evocative, that basically says bathe yourself in blood to transform into a new form, right? Achieve bloody apotheosis. Yes, we have blood twice in the description. I'll probably edit that when I come back and do another pass, but I'm not going to dwell on it here. So for this adversary, I don't want them to be, let's have them be tier 2, right? Just a little bit bigger of a problem, because you might not want to do a phase change right away when your player characters are tier 1. Maybe that makes sense to save. So in my SRD, I'm going to scroll and I'm going to find myself a tier 2 solo who seems sort of comparable. So I could use a secret keeper, right, from the kind of cult faction. I could maybe use, well, a war wizard is ranged. And then Spellblade. Was Spellblade tier 1? I wrote a lot of these adversaries, but I did a lot of that work now 7 months ago, 8 more months ago. So I don't remember all the details automatically. Okay, so let's say we're going to use the Secret Keeper as our template for this enemy, right? So the Secret Keeper here is a tier 2 leader. They have an ability where they can kind of spotlight allies. They're really more of a leader than a solo, so we're going to end up tweaking some of their abilities and replacing them. But enemy mage, some of that stuff is going to be nice to have for a more direct comparison. So, motives and tactics, difficulty for tier 2 Secret Keeper 16. I'm going to only say 15 for this Blood Mage because I think their difficulty might increase in their transformation. The other thing you can do with a phase change is you can have an adversary that has a higher difficulty, but then when they transform, it becomes a lower difficulty because you're going to be farther along in a fight, and the player characters they might have been depleting their resources. Right? Hope tends to refill to a certain amount because slightly over half of the time when you roll, you're going to get hope. So there's different ways that we can do this. Let's say 15 for now. The thresholds are going to be 13, 26. Hit points are going to be 6 here, and then stress is going to be 4. 4 stress is a higher amount because this is a mage type enemy. We're going to give them some features that require spending stress. Their attack is going to be a +3, which is pretty great. And then let's say their basic attack is a Blood Blast. What is a Blood Blast? Couldn't say. You'll get to figure it out. It'll be cool. This is going to be 2d12 physical, magical damage, right? Blood is physical, but being blasted by blood thanks to magic, that makes sense to be magic damage. But we're going to give them more experiences. We're going to say, right, mage +3 and forbidden knowledge +2. Right, so the mage experience can apply for when they're attacking or if they're making a reaction roll against a spell. Forbidden knowledge might mean that they are going to more readily identify something or be able to understand what the player characters are doing. Experiences are also kind of another way of conveying the flavor and the competencies of an adversary, where you might not necessarily apply forbidden knowledge to a roll, but if the adversary has forbidden knowledge, that might inform how you play them. So we can do that. Because this is a solo adversary, right, they're probably going to be relentless. Let's say only relentless 2 here, and rather than try to rewrite relentless from memory, I'm just going to go and grab the text from one of these adversaries in the SRD so that we're staying standardized in our language. Nope, that's not even a little bit what I was trying to do. Thanks, computer. And this gave me a line break, so let's pull this back. The Blood Mage can be spotlighted up to 2 times per GM turn. Spend fear, as usual, to spotlight them. And this is a passive. Right, if we were doing real formatting here, this would get bolded and so on. So let's have an action, AoE, action, and then Sanguine Apotheosis. One of my favorite things about adversary and environment design in Daggerheart is just giving features cool ass names. The emotion demons that we have at tier 3, when I was developing them, the thing that started to really get me excited about that like set of enemies is I was writing the demon of despair, and wrote features named "Your friends will fail you" and "Your struggle is pointless." Now, "Your struggle is pointless" is just a thing that's like, I think it's when you fail, you're in a mark stress or something. But it has there's so much flavor in how it is named that even if the GM doesn't say it aloud, it's going to inform how the GM describes the utilization of that feature. And it communicates something about the vibe of the adversary to a GM or a potential GM when they're reading that stat block. So that's something to think about when you are doing homebrew for Daggerheart, especially that is outward facing, right? That is for people to use, for people to buy and use, is that you can put vibes into an adversary write-up just in how you are naming their features, what you put on their description, and their motives and tactics. Even if you don't have art, you can convey a lot of flavor through the elements that they do have. So in the book, we normally go passives, actions, and then reactions. So when Blood Mage enters, or actually this is going to be first spots a hostile target, activate a countdown for that only advances when a PC rolls with fear. Actually, this is going to be and Blood Ritual, and then it's going to be Sanguine Apotheosis. I was thinking that I would have Blood Ritual. Sorry, here, let me scroll down so that you can see more of what I'm working on. Cool. Blood Ritual was going to be, okay, when they spot a hostile creature, set a countdown. It only ticks when a PC rolls with fear. And when the countdown triggers, they do a phase change. And if they mark their last HP, do that phase change anyway. If we don't end up with too many other features, I think what is going to be easier to use is I want this enemy to be able to do the transformation if they mark their last hit point. But maybe it's cooler if the player characters can stop the Blood Mage before they transform. Here's what we'll do. This is going to be Sanguine Apotheosis. And then when Blood Mage marks their last HP, you may spend fear 1/1 to reduce the Sanguine Apotheosis countdown. If it triggers, replace Blood Mage with Blood Abomination. Right? And so you're fighting the Blood Mage, their countdown is ticking down as the players roll with fear, but the PCs defeat the Blood Mage before the countdown ends. And like, yes, we did it. And then you go, okay, well, there's 2 ticks on the Sanguine Apotheosis countdown. I'm going to spend 2 fear to finish that countdown, and they turn into the Blood Abomination. And the goal there is that the PCs go, no! But they feel like you haven't cheated, that you're putting your thumb on the scale, but you're acknowledging that you're doing that by spending that fear, and you're still getting to bring in the blood abomination for them to have to fight, right? The better the PCs do, the higher the cost you as the GM have to pay to get to use the abomination anyway. But if they aren't able to beat the mage in time, and that countdown does go all the way down to 0 and trigger, replace Blood Mage with Blood Abomination, and they immediately take the spotlight. So with phase changes, generally we've let the adversary who has just changed immediately take the spotlight so that they can then display their new form. So actually, let's change the language here. If that would trigger the countdown, replace Blood Mage per as right. I think we can just do this. When Blood Mage marks the last HP, you may spend fear 1/1 to reduce the Sanguine Apotheosis countdown. If that would trigger the countdown, replace Blood Mage as per Sanguine Apotheosis with Blood Abomination. Right, so we have this way of doing a phase change, and then there's a separate thing that lets you get to do that phase change anyway. So there's still that extra cost if the GM wants to use it before the countdown would normally operate. And we're not even here letting the GM automatically reduce this countdown by having by just spending a fear. I don't think it would be a problem if GMs could reduce this countdown by spending fear, as they can with some other countdowns. But we're focusing on rolling with fear and then that extra fear cost. You may spend fear 1/1 isn't exactly the language we would use in the core book. It might be you may spend any number of fear to reduce the Sanguine Apotheosis countdown by the same amount. Consistency in language is good. It helps make these features easier to read and therefore easy to use. Right? Spend any number of fear, right? It's never going to be more than 4, probably, unless there's some really weird circumstances. But spending 4 fear to bring in an adversary is a lot. Therefore, the GM really wants to be able to have this Blood Mage last long enough into the fight that they're not having to spend as much to use the Blood Abomination. And maybe if they defeat the first Blood Mage, you just hold off, and then maybe you introduce a tier 3 Blood Mage later on, and then that one gets to become an abomination. So this is going to be... What should this attack be? Right, so hemokinesis is the ability to move blood. We're not fully hemomancy here, but we're in the vibe. And mostly what you're seeing is the fact that I am trying to not just use the same word blood for every single feature. of this Blood Mage, right? That's why we have Hemokinetic Burst, Sanguine Apotheosis, and stuff like that. Because if it's Blood Beam, Blood Burst, Blood Fire, that's, not as flavorful maybe. Or it's a little bit more redundant and that's not as much fun. So pick a point. Now this is going to be a Mark of Stress ability. To pick a point within far range, all targets within very close of that point must make a... What is this going to be? I think this is a burst of blood coming from the outside, not a burst of blood from within them, which maybe we have, but maybe I save that for the Blood Abomination. So I'm conscious of not wanting too many of the reaction rolls that you end up with in the game to be agility, because then that makes the agility trait kind of more important to be high. So let's say this is going to be a strength reaction roll, or be knocked prone and made temporarily vulnerable until they next take an action. Let's say take the spotlight. Because this is just mark a stress, they don't have to roll. I think this is going to just be knocked prone and made vulnerable. Not having to roll to hit and then forcing a reaction roll or take damage and become vulnerable is pretty strong. I think maybe we'll have the AoE damaging attack be something for the Abomination, right? Because they're going to get bigger and maybe they can like take swings at anybody who's within very close or close of them. So here we have a passive, Relentless. We gave them an action, this Hemokinetic Burst, which will make the PCs vulnerable. We have that Sanguine Apotheosis where we set a countdown, and every time the PCs roll with fear, that countdown advances. It's only a 4, so the PCs only have to roll with fear 4 times. That's probably going to take roughly 8 or 9 rolls to do. Will this enemy last that many actions? I don't know, right? In the book we have, so maybe I do 7 HP here. We have the encounter building guidelines where you may often end up with a solo and some other adversaries in a fight, or you end up with multiple solos. Some solos are truly meant to be this one can fight a whole party, but parties vary in size and in how much those characters are built for particular types of effectiveness in combat. So getting balance is a little bit of an art, a little bit of a science, right? We could increase the Blood Mage's thresholds. We could give them more hit points. We could increase their difficulty. If we weren't going to make them tougher, we could make them hit harder, right? We could increase this 2d12 damage to make 2d12 plus some bonus, or we could change or add a feature to make it more damaging. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to double check in the SRD how we say phase change. Phase change is after the name, right? So that's going to be Sanguine Apotheosis phase change reaction. So that's how that works. And then we are going to copy this stat block and we are going to paste it down here. And I'm going to move my screen down a little bit until it shows up over here. Are we good? Come on. Nope. Not quite that much. Anyway, so this is a Blood Abomination. So actually, let's follow our model here. Blood Mage Malefactor, right? This is the wizard version. And then Blood Mage Abomination is the transform version. That helps us know that these are two versions of the same. Let's see, and this is going to be replace the malefactor. And replace malefactor with abomination. And then we're going to put abomination back on all on one page, because otherwise it can be annoying. This is still a tier 2 solo. Let's see, and this is going to be a roiling pile mass soup of magical blood and malice. Sure, right, you turned into a vaguely humanoid soup of magical blood and malice. And this is going to be consume blood, harvest power, wreak havoc. Difficulty can then go up, and let's say that their thresholds. So if we have both their difficulty and their thresholds go up, that second phase is going to be proportionately longer. So maybe what we do is decrease their difficulty but increase their thresholds. And let's say they have less stress but more hit points. 7 hit points for the malefactor plus 8 hit points for the abomination means that this adversary in total has 15 hit points, which is a lot. That may then mean that you can have this blood mage truly be the only adversary that is fighting the PCs, because they're still going to hit pretty hard, and they're going to take a lot of hits to bring them down, especially if you're a tier 2 group who mostly are not going to have access to the features or domain abilities or other things that just can automatically do more than 3 hit points of damage at once. They can be made vulnerable by kind of clearing out their stress, right? Maybe I might even do 5 stress for the malefactor and then 3 for the abomination. And this is going to be hi, Prince Justin. What about the mechanics of solos having less of an action economy than multiple ones? Is that a thing in Daggerheart to consider? That's a good question to ask. So in Daggerheart, when the GM gets a turn, right, either from the players rolling with fear or the players rolling a failure, there are also some other times when the GM might get to make a move. We talked about some of that with reactions. When you take a GM turn, normally you only spotlight each adversary one time, so that you don't just be like, here's my strong one. They're just going to go, 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 go. If we have my malefactor, they are going to get to go up to twice. And so I'll think, okay, is Relentless 2 for an enemy that's meant to be more of a set piece, just one foe? Is Relentless 2 going to be enough? So maybe we let them have Relentless 3, which is pretty high for a tier 2 adversary. But then maybe once we get to the abomination, they are only Relentless 2, but then we give them some feature which will let the GM generate fear. And what that does to the action economy is, right, if your PCs go and they hit the abomination and they get a success with fear, they're going to do damage, but then the GM gets a move. So I use the abomination once. Then if I want to use the abomination again, I have to spend a fear, and then I get to have the abomination go twice. And then maybe the PCs get 2 action rolls with hope in a row, and on that third roll, they get a failure with hope. So I get 1 move, but then I would have to spend fear to get to go again with that Relentless 2. If the second phase enemy has a lower Relentless rating, then maybe the thing to do would be to give them a fear generating feature. And what that would be is, in some circumstance, the GM would gain fear, so that then the GM could use that relentless that this adversary does have, even if the players are not rolling with fear as often, right? The GM is going to start the scene with so much fear, and they're going to gain fear mostly from the players getting a result with fear. And then they're going to be spending fear to do these extra moves, to use fear features and things like that. So we might replace this hemokinetic burst with, let's see, chilled blood, right? And so this is going to be a reaction whenever so one of the features you can give an adversary to generate fear is just called momentum. So when they make a successful attack against a PC, you gain a fear. I try to avoid giving an adversary that has relentless momentum, because it's just a more simplistic feedback loop of multiple attacks, because they can attack, succeed, gain fear, spend that fear, attack again because of relentless, succeed, gain fear, attack again because of relentless. That's not as interesting for me as if there's a different axis of interaction along which the abomination tries to focus or operate in order to then generate more fear. And so when a PC marks at least 2 HP from an attack, one of the abominations, the abomination siphons their blood and you gain a fear. Curing 1 HP. Nation clears 1 HP and you gain a fear. So this ended up being pretty powerful, so I'm going to give it a cost of mark a stress. So what that means is, right, the abomination hits a PC with the bloody scythe, right? It's making a scythe out of its bloody corpus. And it hits a PC. And let's say it does, you should do more damage. This is going to be 2d12 plus 4. I might even come back and make this damage be higher. I'm going to go look at my tier 2 adversaries and see what some of the higher, nastier tier 2 attackers are going to do. A shark does 2d12 plus 1. A spectral captain does 2d10 plus 3. What about my solos? Mortal hunter does 2d10 or 2d12 plus 1. So maybe I don't want to go all the way up there. And maybe I start the malefactor at 2d10 plus 2. Looking at my solos here. Juvenile Flickerfly does 2d10 plus 4. So that, and Knight of the Realm does 2d10 plus 4. Gorgon does 2d20 plus 3. We tend to keep the d20s pretty rare. But maybe this is a 2d20 enemy, right? If they're a big set piece solo. Right, then we're setting this 2-phase Blood Mage up to be, cool, you're fighting this Blood Mage, and maybe there's some minions. Probably not a lot more than that. Now, ideally, I write up this adversary, and then I do some playtesting. Right? We make sure that in practice, something in how I've built the adversary isn't operating really outside of the bounds of what I'm expecting. Right? This Bloody Scythe attack should be close, maybe even very close. Because I don't have anything in here that says the abomination can't move as much. Maybe I would add that. So, looking back here, Prince Justin says more complicated patterns are more interesting than simple feedback loops in a combat, right? There are times when you want a simple feedback loop, but you probably don't want to stick with that simple feedback loop. If this abomination only had its normal attack and then things that gave it more fear so that it could use its normal attack more, that's not as interesting as right? Blood Siphon is this reaction. When a PC marks at least 2 HP from one of the abomination's attacks, mark a stress as the abomination siphons their blood. The abomination clears 1 HP and you gain a fear. Right? So as the abomination, it stabs into you with the scythe, and then it sucks the very blood from your form. Notably, if the abomination hits somebody for major damage, and then that PC marks an armor, they have not marked 2 HP from this attack. They're going to mark 1 HP and 1 armor. But if the PCs have used up their armor earlier in the fight, they are going to be more vulnerable, not mechanically vulnerable, but ludonarratively vulnerable to the Blood Siphon. It would also then spotlight some of the rare features that will let a PC regain or clear armor slots. Right, the Guardian has a hope feature called Frontline Tank, where they can spend 3 hope and clear 2 armor slots. That Guardian would really get to kind of take some spotlight and be awesome in a fight like this once the players realize, oh, if we're taking these, if we're taking 2 hit points or more, we're going to, like, the abomination is going to get to heal and the GM is going to gain fear, and we really don't want that. Now, maybe I want to be mean here and increase the abomination's stress pool to 4, because there are going to be times when the PCs are going to deal stress to an adversary, and we still want to let them be able to use this stress ability. I wouldn't want Blood Siphon to cost a fear, because we try to avoid features that cost a fear but can generate a fear, because they're too easy to reuse, especially if they also have some other function. Yeah, Guardians are really cool. I'm so happy with where we ended up with in Daggerheart in terms of what it feels like to be a tanky character. Because when you're a tank, right, you can be protecting people, and that feels cool. You can take hard hits and keep going, which feels cool. And with the way that assistance works in Daggerheart, right, you could never make an attack roll, but you would still feel like you're really contributing in a fight, because you might assist somebody when they're attacking or doing something. You might jump in the way and take a blow that was intended for one of your more fragile people in the party. You might knock somebody back. Maybe that would count as an attack, and maybe it wouldn't. Right? There's a lot of things you can do to feel like you're contributing in a scene without just saying, I attack, here's my dice roll. Guardians and Seraphs, the 2 classes that have Valor, which is the domain of protection. There are cool offensive things in Valor, right? Taking one of those classes does not mean you are committing entirely to being defensive, but the way that tanking works, depending on some of these interactions between abilities and domains and your other features and things, it's really cool. So we've got just Relentless and Blood Siphon so far for the Abomination. They do really heavy damage, but they don't, there isn't a lot other stuff going on because they don't have the phase change. So what I think we're going to do is, I don't think we've used Crimson yet, right? Crimson Whirlwind. Spend a fear to make a Bloody Scythe attack against all targets within close range. On a success, the target must also mark a stress. Right, and so what this represents is the Blood Mage-abomination is this kind of shifting mass of blood, and when you can spend a fear to have it kind of lash out in every direction. Right, so if the 4 PCs are all within close range, the abomination rolls once and it applies that attack against every single PC or any number of PCs the GM wants. And each of them that is hit, they also have to mark a stress in addition to whatever hit points or armor they end up marking from the damage, because this is a bloody scythe attack, right? So it's still going to do that normal 2d20 damage. This enemy might be too strong, but maybe then they are okay to be a true solo enemy, where you don't need to give anybody else, you don't need to have anybody else supporting them. I'll probably want to kind of put this Blood Mage adversary into like a danger room kind of scenario and see how it goes, right? Does it end up being too overwhelming, or is that 2d20 damage too much when the Blood Mage is also deployed alongside other adversaries, right? Because a solo adversary in the battle point system is usually not enough to be the actual only threat for PCs in a group if you're using that system. Yeah, right. I would use the Blood Mage in a danger room and have it and use the battle point system, right? Where here's a solo and then I have other stuff. How does that work? Versus danger room scenario and it's just them. Do they actually present a threat above and beyond the way that we account for the threat of a solo in the battle point system? Which is, again, why I said earlier that encounter balance in Daggerheart is both an art and a science, because you need to know what your party can do, and do they do more magic attacks? Do they do more physical attacks? How likely are they to spread out during a fight? How much can they heal? How much can they do stress recovery? How well do they handle having not as much hope if you're using an adversary that can make the player characters lose hope? There's enough different axes along which the game operates that I'm not going to say that there's no point in trying to do encounter design. It's more that because having a cool story is more important, sometimes encounters are not supposed to be balanced. Sometimes a fight is supposed to feel almost unwinnable. And sometimes it makes sense for the player characters to just wipe the floor with somebody. And so you don't always need to have a perfectly calibrated encounter. It's like, yes, this encounter will consistently force the player characters to use 50% of their resources. It's not quite that tactical of a game, at least as I experience it. So I feel pretty good about this Blood Mage Abomination, at least in terms of taking them into testing. We could easily give them more features, especially if they're meant to be a true solo, because as is written, this abomination would basically do bloody scythe attacks, and it would do crimson whirlwinds, and then when it hits with the scythe, it would siphon. That's not a ton of things to do. So maybe when abomination marks 2 or more HP, the attack causes a bloody detonation, forcing the attacker. So this is from an attack within close to make a So when abomination marks 2 or more hit points from an attack within close, the attack causes a bloody detonation, right? Part of the abomination just bursts, forcing the attacker to make an agility reaction roll or mark 2 stress. Hey, Tide of War. Thanks for tuning in. So the abomination has 8 hit points, and the malefactor has 7. So that's 15 hit points. At best, that's 5 attacks that each do 3 hit points. It's more likely that this is going to be 7 or 8 attacks, each dealing an average of 2 hit points, right? When you get a crit, you're probably going to do 3 hit points. If you land a blow, but it's with an attack that's not as strong, you might do 1 hit point. And there is that possibility that Sanguine Apotheosis will let the malefactor transform into the abomination before all of their hit points have been taken out. Difficulty 15 is not super hard for a tier 2 character. Most tier 2 characters are going to have a +3 in their spellcast trait and or their primary attack trait. And the average roll on a duality die, right, the duality dice 2d12 is a 13. So you're going to be able to consistently hit the Blood Mage. And their thresholds are not gigantic, right? If you have a proficiency of 2, let's say you're doing 2d8 damage, 2d8 plus 3, that's 9, 12. So you might come a little bit short. You're gonna want those higher damage pools. So I do think this would be a tough fight. Part of why I had that impulse to go back and add more features is because I do think this could end up being a long fight. And in a longer fight, you want variety so that it doesn't feel like it's turning into a slogfest, right? Through playtesting, I might decide, actually, I want a total of 12 hit points. And so it's going to be 5 for the malefactor and 7 for the abomination. And then I'm going to reduce that Sanguine Apotheosis countdown to a 2, where they activate it. And then if there's 2 rolls with fear in a roll, it activates into the abomination. And then the abomination is a decently tough fight on its own with their 8 HP. There's enough moving parts here that I'm probably just going to want to do some testing. Right, unstable form, I might end up moving this down to only marking 1 stress. Or I would make this marks 3 or more HP, so that only the strongest hits make the player characters have to do a reaction roll. Or maybe it's they mark 1 stress and become vulnerable until their next roll with hope. Right, so maybe we do this: mark a stress and become vulnerable until their next roll with hope. Another option I could do, right, is I could change some of the flavor to what this reaction thing is, right? Is it like the blood seeping into your clothes and, right, you have this feeling that this thing is getting into you? And then maybe it's a presence reaction roll or you lose hope. Right, and then that undermines a different resource. As you get farther into a fight, right, if you're consistently using hope for hope features or for utilizing experiences, any one of those rolls that is a success with fear, you're not getting that hope back, and you might start to bleed through your hope, especially if you're using hope, the kind of 3-cost hope features. And so then something like a hope removing feature could get really rough, right? You could then also maybe add a passive that says when Abomination makes an attack against an against a PC who has 0 hope, it gains advantage, right? Those are some of the levers that you can utilize to tweak, right? You can tune up the difficulty, or you can tune difficulty towards particular event states. Yeah, right. A debuff. So a debuff that prevent the use of hope abilities. I generally shy away from features for adversaries and environments that say you just can't use your ability. But I might say there might be a debuff that says, you know, a PC becomes, I don't know, it's like bloodied is a term in 4E, but maybe we just use it here anyway, right? Something makes a PC bloodied, and it says, while bloodied, they must mark a stress whenever they use a hope feature, right? Because it's straining. They don't have to use the hope features. They can still use them, but it's going to exact cost, right? And it would be, you have to mark a stress whenever you use a hope feature until your next roll with hope or until you clear a hit point or something like that, right? We put some parameters on it where it creates a problem and shows how this fight is wearing on the character, but it doesn't say, so this whole set of your abilities, just forget about them for today. Again, we come back to whatever principles are in Daggerheart, and those principles include being a fan of the characters. So we want to see the characters using their cool abilities. We might just make it harder. We might just make it cost more to achieve that victory. Okay, so we are about at 90 minutes for this stream if we count my lead in, and I don't know that I can beat the Blood Blood Mage-Abomination today. I think that might have been the best idea that I have, and we've shopped a little bit. So what I want to do is I'm going to remind folks that, let's see, I'm going to find you the Get Your Sheet Together playlist from Critical Role, because these are really good videos that have a great, really efficient, condensed advice on playing and running Daggerheart. And I definitely want folks to go and watch those videos if they haven't been. Additionally, the better that Daggerheart material on Critical Role does, the more likely Critical Role and Darrington Press is to make more Daggerheart stuff. I think that the response so far has been really good. We know that the Critical Role store online sold out of the standard edition of Daggerheart. We know that the limited edition has sold out. There's a number of stores that I'm hearing in different regions. They're also selling out. Retailers, including Amazon, Barnes & Noble, indie bookstores, and other hobby stores, are going to get their copies through distribution on June 3rd, I believe, on or by June 3rd. So there's copies there to buy, and you can buy digital versions from DriveThruRPG and get the Daggerheart Nexus from Demiplane. So there's other ways of getting the game. You can also just download the SRD. It doesn't have all of the text, but it has all the important baseline rules. Excellent DriveThruRPG for Tide of War. So if you're digging Daggerheart, the best thing that you can do to make sure that there is more Daggerheart, right, more releases, more actual play series, more whatever, is to keep talking about Daggerheart, get people excited about it, see if you can encourage, convince, or gift people to buy copies, right? Driving sales is the way to tell Critical Role and Darrington Press, we love Daggerheart and we want more Daggerheart. So I'm doing these streams because I really love the game and I feel like I have a lot to add. And right, if Darrington decides they want to make a bunch more Daggerheart, that might lead to me getting more freelance work, which I certainly wouldn't hate. I would love it because I do, again, like working on the game. These are the tools that I have for working on the game right now, right? Using this third-party ecosystem where we see that potion bottle with the kind of Daggerheart flame on it is that indication that we're doing community content right now. And so that's my overall pitch. If you are watching this on Twitch, live or VOD, know that I have more other Daggerheart stuff over at YouTube, which is where my stuff gets archived because it's easier to archive over there. YouTube.com/MikeUnderwood. I have how to make and use campaign frames, including a preview of a new original campaign frame I'm developing for publication through the CGL. There is how to make and use environments, including a little bit of homebrew for environments, not as much as here with Adversaries. And then Friday, so in 2 days from now, as I speak and stream to you, I'm going to do a stream on a deep dive for GMing Daggerheart, right? So we'll talk about GM principles and best practices. I will talk like GMing philosophy more broadly, like what approaches and styles and stances I think are really effective with Daggerheart. Not the only ones I think are effective, but based on my understanding and perspective of the design, having been involved, here are things about GMing I think are important to think about, consider, or look into to see if they fit for you. So that's going to be all for today. Thank you so much to everybody who came to hang out on the stream. If you're watching the VOD on Twitch or YouTube, thanks for giving this video a chance and taking a look at what I have to say about the game. So thank you, Prince Justin. Thank you, Tide of War. And thank you to anybody else who is watching or is watching in the future. And I've been Mike Underwood. You can find me on Blue Sky at mikerunderwood.bsky.social. I'm going to put that in here. And then I'm going to call it a day. Thank you all. Take care. Actually, I'm going to try to be a good Twitch citizen and figure out if I can go and raid somebody to help them out. Okay. Nobody that I know and have something to send them to is streaming it just right now. So I will go ahead and call it. Thanks again for everybody for watching. Come back on Friday or tune in on YouTube this Saturday, 24 hours after that, for my video on GMing. And if you haven't already, I'd love if you could follow on Twitch, subscribe on YouTube, do the normal streamer things, because the better these channels do, the easier it is for me to get information out to share with other folks. So now I'm actually done, and I will see you later.